I got my clicker and everything. Hi, good morning. Oh, I'm really loud. All right, that's fine. My name is Lacey, and I'm here from the University of Texas at Austin, and I just want to thank all of you for having me here today. I was at DjangoCon last week, and whenever I told them I was coming here this week, everyone said, oh, you will love it. They're the sweetest people ever. It's the best conference. So this is my first Postgres Open, and I'm really looking forward to it. But I just wanted to, first of all, thank Stephen for having me, and thank all of you as well. But I didn't always want to be a developer, and I didn't start out that way. And since this is a talk on open source and higher ed, I wanted to go through a couple of slides to tell you about how I've experienced higher ed and some of the things that I've done with respect to that. So I got my bachelor's degree in English, actually, from Auburn University. And at the time, I wanted to be an English professor. I wanted to teach and write scholarly articles about literature and be in the ivory tower. But whenever I got there, I started gearing myself more toward tech things. So I was the webmaster for a professor's website, which was written in Dreamweaver and stored on a zip drive. That was pretty awesome. And I also worked in the technology center, where I made screencasting videos that helped other teachers and faculty learn how to use Blackboard, which is sort of an online classroom management system. And we'll talk a little bit more about Blackboard and some other technologies like it a little bit later. My first job out of college was at Midwestern State University, and it again wasn't a tech job, but I wound up being the webmaster of the department site that I worked for, which was a testing center. So I gave computer-based high-stakes tests for people to get different kinds of certifications. And then I went to grad school. I got a master's in English because I still wanted to be a professor, or so I thought. But again, I rejected all of the things at Texas A&M that would have gotten me to that would have been on the professorial track. So instead of teaching, I worked in the English Technology Center, and I would pair with other professors and graduate students to teach them how to integrate technology into their classrooms. So I talked with them about how they could use Google Docs to help their students collaborate on different projects. And I taught them how to use WordPress, and Texas A&M was using Moodle at the time, which is the open source version of Blackboard, so I was teaching them how to do that. My second year, I worked for the World Shakespeare Bibliography, which is another website. It's a website that collects all of the scholarly articles all over the world written about Shakespeare and publishes summaries on them. And while I was doing that, I had to use some markup so that the staff of the journal could copy and paste what I was producing directly into the website. And I didn't realize that that was a type of coding. I just didn't know that that's what I was doing, but I kind of was. Then I took this workshop on TEI, which is the Text Encoding Initiative. And it's an open source XML markup language that's specific to manuscripts. So it has tags for things like title, publisher, author, etc. But it also has some really cool things. So if you're transcribing a handwritten document for the web, there are tags that can represent that an author, for example, scratched through one line of text and replaced it with something else above it. And you can represent that in TEI, which was really cool. So by the time I finished at A&M, it had become pretty clear that I was not going to become a professor, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. But it was also pretty clear that I wanted to do something kind of techy. I didn't really know what that would be. And this is where the University of Texas kind of enters my life. I found out about this really wonderful program they have. It's the Software Developer Training Program, and it's kind of one of a kind these days. It's an apprenticeship program where they paid me. So for 6 months, I collected a salary and benefits so that they could teach me how to program for the university. And then they gave me a full-time job at the university after that. The catch is that the University of Texas is still on a mainframe. So how many of you have heard of Natural? Oh, this is actually, I knew Postgres, there's more hands than I usually see. That's good. So yes, I learned Natural, and we have an database backend. But we do a lot of Python Django on top of that. So if you've ever used Django models, I never had until earlier this year, even though I've been developing in Django for 4 years, because we don't use any of the database backends that come with Django. For the Office of Admissions, I wrote a lot of internal applications that go with our SIS, our Student Information System software. But for the past couple of years, I've mostly been working on this. This is Apply Texas, and it is a natural database system that has a web top end. Obviously, this is a website. But basically, Apply Texas is a statewide common college application. So if you're a high school senior in the state of Texas and you want to go to a Texas college, you use Apply Texas. And this is my test account. So the Lovegood up there, all of my test accounts are named after Harry Potter characters. So this is my Luna Lovegood account. And you can see she's applying to like Austin College and Texas A&M and some other places. And so the cool thing is that you can copy one application from another. or to another application, so you don't have to fill out completely separate applications for each school that you're applying to. So this is kind of the biggest part of my job right now, is working on Apply Texas. But I do some open source stuff too. This year I was one of the organizers for DjangoCon, which happened last week in Austin, Texas. And those were all the people who told me that y'all were so great. And then I also do a lot of work for Django Girls. Django Girls is a nonprofit organization that provides people with the resources they need to put on one-day workshops to teach women how to program in just one day. So you take a group of women who don't have any prior coding experience, and you, in about 8 or 9 hours, teach them how to build and deploy a website. I've helped organize 2 of those workshops, and now I'm on their support team. So most of my open source work is of the sort of community nature. I do conferences, I do workshops, I do documentation. I don't do a whole lot of code. But still, I think that this speaking here is one of the things I do for open source. So hopefully in this talk, we will talk about sort of the Venn diagram between open source and higher ed and how some of my experience has kind of come into play with that. And then my hope is that by the end of this talk, you'll have some ideas about how Postgres specifically or some other open source projects that you work on could get into the higher ed space and help us out, because we could really use your help. So the first piece of overlap in that Venn diagram between open source and higher ed is pretty obvious. It's education. And the education part of higher ed is right there in the name, so we won't go too deeply into that. But you see a lot of education in open source and at open source conferences. Day 1 of this conference was 4 different workshops, all designed to teach you all who are here how to use different aspects of Postgres or other tools that you might not otherwise be familiar with. And this is really common at a lot of open source conferences. DjangoCon, PyCon, they all start with a day 1 that is really tutorial driven. The Django Girls ecosystem is entirely built around workshops. But even beyond that, we have tutorials that are specific to teaching people how to contribute to open source projects. So Daniele Procida, 2 years ago, totally open sourced his Don't Be Afraid to Commit tutorial, which is all about teaching people who write in Python Django how to contribute to open source projects in Python and Django. Since the tutorial is open sourced, it's been given about 15 times in the past 2 years. And the whole idea is that you learn about Git and GitHub, and you contribute to an open source project before you finish the tutorial, which is really cool. And I see a lot of this kind of trend toward learning by doing and toward learning through community building happening in education too. I see a lot of higher ed starting to move more toward this sort of workshop, tutorial, technical format. So like I said, I went to Texas A&M, and at the time I wanted to be a professor, and so a lot of my friends did go on to become college professors, and now I get to see the kinds of work that they're doing. So they're doing things like using WordPress or Twitter hashtags or collaborative Google Docs to do assignments instead of regular papers. I have one friend who was teaching a technical writing seminar, and in lieu of a final paper, he had his students put together submissions to the website instructables.com, and several of those actually got featured on the website's homepage the week after they were submitted. So these are really unique and cool ways that I feel like higher ed is starting to kind of mimic the sort of open source workshop, tutorial-driven education system that we see in our system. The other thing is transparency. That's kind of another piece in that overlap between open source and higher ed. And especially in higher ed and in public higher ed, transparency isn't just a value, it's a legal requirement. Like, my commit messages are subject to open records request. You could go and file a request right now, and you could find out a lot of information about what happens at the university, which is a good thing, right? We believe that about open source too. Our commit messages are all public. We know who made a contribution, when they did it, who merged that contribution. And part of that is so that we all know what's going on and we all know what's at stake. And it also means that our open source projects, hopefully, are really secure. Whenever security holes happen, they're public. Everyone knows about them. And so they stay open until they get fixed. Things get fixed faster. More hands make light work, all of that. But whenever we get into higher ed, transparency takes on a slightly different meaning. And I think that a really great example of that is the Texas Tribune. I know a lot of you are not from Texas. Are you familiar with the Texas Tribune? Okay, not really. It is a nonpartisan media company that is dedicated to publishing information about Texas that Texans would find interesting, especially politically. And they have this section of their website that is just called data. and you click on data, and they've collected all sorts of open records information about hospitals and bills before the legislature, higher ed, government salaries, including mine, and you can just go in and you can explore with data visualization what all of these pieces of data mean. And although the Texas Tribune is not specifically an open source project, and it's not a higher ed project, for me it kind of represents a really nice meeting in the middle. This is where you sort of see a lot of these values intersecting, is with the Texas Tribune. And speaking of open source, although they are not an open source project, they are a company, they have open sourced a lot of their code, and it's in Django, and it's on GitHub, and you can go check it out and look through it. And other people who are not employed by them do commit to their code and submit pull requests and stuff. And then the final piece that I want to kind of talk about before we get into some specifics on open source projects in the higher ed space is our users. And I use users as a pretty broad term. We all know from our work that there is no user, right? There's no like one user that we can point to and say, this is what we mean when we say user. At a university, we talk about students, but also applicants and alumni. We talk about staff, but also vendors who aren't employed by us. They just do really awesome work for us. We talk about, at the University of Texas, we talk about fans. You know, people who are fans of Longhorn football, they are some of our stakeholders as well. And in the Postgres world, your users also encompass a pretty wide variety of different kinds of people and companies, right? So like everyone in here is a user of Postgres except my mom. Although she is, like she goes on Instagram, although actually no she doesn't, but my sister does, she's here too. She goes on Instagram, Instagram uses Postgres. Django Girls uses Postgres. Django itself is a Postgres user because we provide a lot of optimizations in our code base specifically for Postgres. So, and everyone that I know who works either in higher ed or on open source projects takes that commitment to our users really seriously. And whenever we make changes, we have to think about how that's going to impact our users all the way down, starting from the top all the way to the bottom. So now I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk with you about some open source projects in higher education that you might not be 100% familiar with. And this is Qawali, and it's, oh, you can't see the link is kuali.org. But this is one of the coolest open source projects in the higher ed space that I know about right now. And the reason is because it's not a learning management system, and it's not one specific tool. It's this whole set of apps that make up a student information system. And student information systems are what I work on. That's what I do. That's the programming that does the work of the university. So it handles class registration and tuition and time to degree and room booking and all these other things. And Qawali has a lot of different pieces to it. So there's Qawali Student, but also Qawali Finance, Qawali Library, et cetera. And they're not strictly open source. They're more community source. So they have a lot of different university partners, including private institutions, some international universities, but also like larger institutions like the University of Southern California, and a lot of the UC system schools are part of Qawali. And so the idea is that every year or so, they release a new piece of Qawali, and so hopefully over time, they have finally released enough of it to make it a full replacement for an SIS at a university. And this is really interesting, right? Because it's not 100% an agile approach, but by taking this sort of piecemeal release cycle, they've enabled themselves to really get together and focus on, okay, well, what do we want to do for course registration, specifically course registration? Okay, now this year we've done that. What do we want to do specifically with tuition and billing? The problem with that for a really large university is that whenever we decide to upgrade, our people in suits who make that decision want to upgrade everything. We don't want to wait for Qawali to figure out what it's going to be. And so that, I think, is kind of hurting Qawali with getting adopters from really large institutions. But my hope is that we will see more universities adopting Qawali and also contributing to Qawali as time goes on. Now, what I was talking about with how it can be kind of difficult for universities to talk about adopting something like Qawali. Whenever I was speaking about this conference and what I was going to talk about with my supervisor, Tim Brace, he said this, that software developed by and for higher ed needs a lot of flexibility due to the various needs of different parts of campus. So we have a lot of different stakeholders, and we have a lot of different definitions in different departments. Current student means something different for undergrads than it does for graduate students. And I know this personally. I had a project a couple of years ago where all I had to do was let only current graduate students onto this one page. And it took a month of back and forth to figure out, what do you mean by current student? What about in the summer? What about if they're in absentia? Well, you can't use how many hours they're registered for because dissertation students only register for 3 hours and not 9. And even that hour thing, for undergraduate students, 12 hours is full-time. For graduate students, usually 8 or 9 hours is full-time. So a service like Qawali needs to be able to be really flexible. You need to be able to put in your own custom definitions for things. Because even on Apply Texas, we have a lot of different universities who use our system, and they all have different ideas about what constitutes a transfer student. So we can't put students through a wizard that says, do you have this qualification? Did you graduate at this point? What are your goals? And then tell them, you should fill out a freshman application versus you should fill out a transfer application. Because every university defines this slightly differently. So an SIS replacement like Qawali has to be able to be that flexible. So this is another example that I think probably a lot of you have heard of. It's Moodle. How many people have heard of Moodle? Yeah, that's wonderful. So for those of you that haven't, it's a learning management system, also called an LMS. And it's basically an online classroom, which doesn't mean that it can only be used for online classes. It also gets used for in-person classes, but then you can go online to have a calendar. Your teacher can upload documents for you to look at. There are discussion boards. And this kind of learning management system software, there seem to be a lot of different open source projects in this space. So we'll go over a couple others before we leave here today. But Moodle is the most popular. And you can see on this diagram that that red line is Blackboard, and the orange line creeping up on it is Moodle. And part of the reason for that kind of close adoption is that Blackboard has actually wound up investing in Moodle and in a lot of the companies that have cropped up who support Moodle. And then a lot of these others are open source projects that are in the same kind of learning management system space. What you also see, too, is that a lot of times the smaller schools are the ones who are adopting Moodle, and the larger schools are the ones who are adopting Blackboard. And there's some thought on why that might be. And the idea is that it might be possible that for smaller schools, it's easier for them to experiment with something. It's easier for them to say, well, this year we're going to try out this new system, and if it doesn't work out next year, we'll just back it out. It's a lot harder and more expensive for a university, say the size of UT, to do these little experiments and install something new. That's a whole lot of overhead for us. But a smaller school might be able to make that change. So then we get to Canvas, which is an open source learning management system like Moodle and like Blackboard. And this is what UT uses. And I know from the developer's perspective, UT has been very happy with Canvas. And it is a little bit different in that it actually is a company, and so it is open source, but it's a company. And so the free version is you download the code, you manage your own installation and implementation, and it's all DIY. And then the paid version comes with some of that support. And that support can be really, really helpful for larger universities, but also it can be really, really helpful in the adoption process in the first place. If there's a company behind a particular open source project that stands to make some money or a little bit of profit off of this, they send in a salesperson. They send in somebody to answer questions and to make a proposal. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important here in a little bit. And then this is Sakai. And Sakai is yet another learning management system project in the open source space. And they're used by a lot of universities, too. You might remember from the diagram that they also are kind of creeping up there, but they're still at the bottom below Moodle and Blackboard. They're used by the Oregon Health and Sciences University, where my husband is a student. And he's had good things to say about them as a user, too. And then before we leave open source projects totally, I feel like we can't really talk about higher ed without these days talking about the MOOCs, the massively open online courses. And this is what OpenEDX does. They provide a platform for a university to offer those massively open online courses. So Stanford is probably the most famous example of this, and their courses are hosted with OpenEDX, which is also a Django project, which makes me kind of excited. And something that you might have noticed, and before we get into what this slide means, which is pretty cool, something you might have noticed is that I had 5 different projects there. 3 of them were learning management systems, and only 1 of them was an SIS, was a replacement for the student information system that does the work of managing students at the university. And like I talked about earlier, that's because we have to be really, really, really flexible in our SIS software. We have to be able to write a lot of custom code or make a lot of custom definitions. I think writing a learning management system its job is much more straightforward, and it's much easier from a programming perspective. Doing something like an SIS as an open source project, I bless their hearts at Qawali. They're doing the Lord's work there because I feel like that's an incredibly complicated thing to do. But I hope that we'll see some of that changing, and I think part of the reason why is because this is something really cool. This is from the Rochester Institute of Technology, and last year in 2014, they started offering a minor in open source and free culture. And so the idea is that in a formal way, students learn about open source theories and ideas. They contribute to open source humanitarian projects, and they learn about the legal and financial ramifications of open source projects and how you might start an open source project that you then were able to keep going financially. So my hope is that as we see open source cropping up more in the higher ed space in a formal way, then maybe we'll start producing developers and open source maintainers who will kind of turn back around and serve higher education. But I want to talk a little bit about why we don't see more open source adoption in the higher ed space, especially in larger institutions like the University of Texas. And there's this really interesting article in Inside Higher Ed that I'm going to quote from a couple of times here. And the first thing that I think kind of stops higher ed, especially large higher ed, from adopting more open source systems is this. They don't have faith that an ad hoc community will be able to support them in a crisis. So whenever you have a contract with a vendor, if something goes wrong, there's a legal remedy. There's an idea that if something breaks, you have a legal requirement to get in and fix it. And you don't have that whenever you adopt an open source solution. So there's this fear from higher ed stakeholders that if they adopt open source, it might just disappear. You know, the people who maintain this open source project might just stop doing it. They might get bored, or they might move on to other things. And we know that that's happened. We all can think of open source projects that started out really promising and we were really excited about, and then they just kind of fizzled for a lot of different reasons. But we also know that in a lot of ways, open source projects might be safer and easier to maintain than these closed vendor systems. Whenever we come back and think about transparency, we can think about things like the fact that a security patch is public and it's open, and we can discuss what is the best way to fix that thing. And we can also be part ourselves of maintaining the code and making it do what we need it to do. The other thing has to do with resources and money. So this says large public schools have the hardest time maintaining and implementing open source programs because they're competing for talent against private companies. And this is the thing that happens at the University of Texas. Because our code base is so large and because it's so custom, developer time winds up being spent a whole lot on maintaining the current solution instead of implementing a new solution or building a new tool. See above mainframe, right? Like this is why our mainframe has stuck around for so long, because it's hugely expensive to replace, and we literally cannot do a code freeze for 12 months to upgrade it. That's not an option for us. So we have to keep maintaining the current thing while also thinking about the new thing. And in the meantime, we wind up losing developers to other companies that can pay them better because, you know, we're all government workers and we have government salaries. So like, we're not seeing Silicon Valley money working for a university. But also, it's really, really expensive to implement a new system at a university that's the scale of the University of Texas, for example, because we have to have these concurrent systems, and because we have to do this in stages. So we have to maintain and pay for the current system while also implementing and paying for the new system. And so we have to be really, really careful. And that's why having things like contracts are really, really attractive to the people in suits. Because we're spending millions of dollars to upgrade a system, we want to make sure that someone's going to be there to keep the lights on. We want to make sure that we're going to have help whenever we need it. And this is kind of what brings me to how can we form this bridge between open source maintainers and open source developers and higher education developers. And one of the questions that I have for Postgres, and this is a question I don't know. I'm wearing a blazer, but I'm not one of the people in the suits. I'm not in the room whenever decisions about what direction the university will go are getting made. So the question I have is that whenever an RFP is released by a large company or by a university where they're requesting proposals from people about taking on this new product, is Postgres in the room? Is your project in the room? Does someone from open source respond to those proposals? Because if you don't, nobody is talking about you. And that's kind of the thing that I want to get across. It's not that the developers don't think of you, it's that the people in suits don't know about you. And if somebody in that room says, hey, what about Postgres, or what about this other open source project? I was talking about this with people at DjangoCon last week, and they've actually seen the people in suits say, oh, that sounds really cool. You take this on. You develop the proof of concept and answer the questions and come up with a budget and do all these things that aren't actually in your wheelhouse, right? Like, none of us are salespeople. None of us are people who go and try to convince the people in suits to use our project. But the people in suits need a salesperson, and they need someone who's going to answer those questions. And none of us are going to do that exactly. So I think that one of the best ways to build that bridge is to get more higher ed developers contributing to open source so that we are better equipped to be those advocates for the open source projects that we feel like would be beneficial to our universities and to our departments. And so now I have a challenge for you. This is a presentation made by Kenneth Reitz, and it's called Growing Open Source Seeds. And I encourage you, especially if you are an open source maintainer or you have the commit bit on an open source project, to look up this presentation and watch it. Because one of the things it talks about is what your responsibility is as an open source maintainer. What can you do to make your project more approachable to a new committer to your project? And again, whenever I was preparing for this presentation, I asked a lot of my colleagues about, do you commit to open source projects in your spare time? And if so, what projects? And if not, why not? And most of them don't. And a couple of them had tried to, but the documentation was a mess, so they couldn't figure out what they needed to get installed. Or they submitted a pull request, but never heard back. And they pinged the maintainer several times to say, hey, is there something wrong? Can I do something different? And just never, ever heard back. So don't be that maintainer. Invite us in. Treat us like you would do any other new committer, and try to make your project as welcoming as possible to new developers, especially developers from higher ed, so that we are better placed to advocate for your project in our institutions. And that is pretty much all I have. The whole point of this presentation was to kind of talk about how to build a bridge between higher education and the open source community. And as you can see, there are a lot of bridges already there. There are a lot of commonalities between the two communities, and I think that we have a lot to offer one another. And I know that higher ed certainly needs help from open source. So I'm asking all of you to do whatever you think you can to help that process along. And I'll be available in the hall and for the next couple of days if you want to talk with me about that more specifically. But that's it. Thank you so much.